We spend so much time, thinking about our own lives, our own happiness. But have you ever really kind of stopped and thought about what well-being looks like, not just for you over your lifetime, but like across generations? It's a really kind of mind-bending question, almost like putting on a philosopher's hat for a minute and
Yeah.
trying to figure out like what does a good society even mean when you've got to factor in people who haven't even been born yet?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It really is getting into some very, very deep philosophical waters there. I mean, how
Hmm.
do you even begin to weigh the needs of future generations against our own?
Right.
When we make choices today about the economy, about the environment, how much weight should we be giving to their prospects, decades or even centuries down the line? And I guess the really big question underneath all of this is how much should a nation be saving and investing for the future?
Yeah.
Especially when you think about these huge challenges like climate change.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly where we're going to start in this deep dive. We're going to journey back to 1928 to the work of this really fascinating thinker named Frank Ramsey. And he wasn't just an economist. He was really kind of acting as a philosopher, using economic tools to try and grapple with these really big questions. And the perspective he was coming from is called classical utilitarianism.
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting that even though Ramsey's ideas were, I mean, incredibly insightful, um, they didn't really make a huge splash right away in the economics world. The world was in the middle of the Great Depression at that time,
Hmm.
massive unemployment, and just this immediate economic hardship everywhere you looked. So Ramsey's focus on the long run, assuming everyone had jobs, um, it kind of felt a bit out of touch with the urgent problems of the day.
Yeah, it's almost like a twist of fate in a way. uh, this incredibly influential work kind of simmered on the back burner for a while. But then after World War II, you had all these countries focused on rebuilding and thinking about long-term economic development. Suddenly, Ramsey's framework starts to look incredibly relevant. It gave people a way to systematically think about the well-being of societies over these really long stretches of time.
Exactly. His ideas became super important, really fundamental in a whole bunch of fields. I mean, from actually guiding economic planning, in centrally managed economies to, evaluating the long-term benefits of like big social projects. It even laid the groundwork for analyzing technology choices in developing countries, especially ones with really large labor forces.
Hmm.
And really crucially, I think it's been essential in how we approach the economics of climate change, which at its core is really about decisions we make now that have these huge impacts on future generations.
Yeah. And it's not an exaggeration to say that Ramsey's 1928 paper is a total giant in the field. I mean, it's constantly ranked as one of the most important economics papers of the 20th century. So let's try to unpack this classical utilitarianism a bit, because that's really the foundation that Ramsey was building on. What's the core idea there?
Well, at its heart, classical utilitarianism is all about maximizing happiness or well-being,
Hmm.
across all individuals and across all time. Ramsey actually used the term enjoyment originally, but you can kind of think of it as trying to create the greatest good for the greatest number of people, not just right now, but extending indefinitely into the future. And this connects to the idea of, a sort of neutral, impartial decision maker, sometimes can call like government house utilitarianism,
Hmm.
striving for this kind of ethical guidance that tries to consider everyone's needs equally.
It's a pretty powerful aspiration when you think about it. And, our sources actually suggest that if we try to think about well-being in a richer way, than just enjoyment, to encompass all the things that contribute to a good and flourishing life, well, then Ramsey's framework could become even more insightful for us today as we're trying
Thanks.
to kind of, act as these far-sighted philosophers ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, while Ramsey used the language of utility and enjoyment, the core principles are really adaptable. By taking this broader understanding of well-being, you can start to incorporate a much wider range of things that matter for a good life, both now and for those future generations we're talking about.
Okay, so the mission for this deep dive is really to understand how Ramsey, acting as a philosopher with an economist's toolkit, how he
hmm
approached these super fundamental questions of well-being across time. What were some of the key elements of the framework he developed?
Well, Ramsey's practical goal was actually quite specific. He wanted to figure out how much a nation should ideally save for the future. And to tackle this, he started with a very particular assumption about population. He essentially took the number of future people as a given, as something that's predictable and not really affected by our choices today. The philosopher Derek Parfit later called this a same numbers choice. Our decisions today don't change how many people will exist in the future.
Okay, so in Ramsey's model, the decision maker, whether it's this government house or just, a socially conscious citizen trying to think about the really long run, they're trying to maximize the well-being of everyone present and future. But of course, they have to work within the limits of, whatever resources are available.
Exactly. And to make this whole thing more manageable, Ramsey made some simplifying assumptions. He imagined a world where everyone's basically the same, which allows you to think in terms of like a single representative individual or even a family line that goes on forever. He also worked with continuous time, which often makes the math a bit easier.
Hmm.
And in his model, there's only one resource, one commodity, and it doesn't decay or anything. You can either use it up by consuming it, or you can save and invest it. And it's a closed economy, no trade with other countries. And to keep things simple, at least initially, he assumes that the amount of labor people are willing to supply is fixed. So, the downsides of working more are not really part of the picture in this basic setup.
Okay, so a very stripped down version of an economy. Just to help think through these really big philosophical questions. So, how does production actually work in this world? How does the economy grow?
So output, which we can call FK, depends only on the amount of capital in the economy, which is, Ramsey made some standard assumptions here. If you have no capital, you can't produce anything. So more capital means more output. So the extra output you get from each additional bit of capital gets smaller and smaller as you accumulate more. Yeah. And importantly, this basic model doesn't include things like new technologies or natural resources. Those are kind of left out for simplicity.
Okay, so it's this cycle of capital, generating more capital, which can then either be used for enjoyment now or put aside to increase future capacity. And this leads to, I think, a core equation in Ramsey's thinking, right?
Yeah, the fundamental dynamic of the whole model is captured by this equation,
Huh.
FKDTT, which just means that the change in the amount of capital over time, and this is basically investment since the capital doesn't wear out, is equal to the total output minus whatever gets consumed. And this really highlights the basic trade-off at the heart of everything. If we consume more today, we have less to invest, which could mean lower output and consumption in the future. And of course, you can flip that around. So it forces us to really grapple with this philosophical question of, how do we balance present desires with these future possibilities?
And this brings us right to the heart of the ethical considerations, the whole classical utilitarian way of thinking, and this really, I guess, significant debate around whether or not we should discount the well-being of future generations. And Ramsey, as we've heard, had very strong opinions on this.
Oh, he
Oh.
did. He really did. So Ramsey formalized the total well-being, across all future time from a given point as uh, infestile. And importantly, there's no discounting of future well-being in that formula. He assumes that well-being at any point in time depends only on how much is consumed at that time.
Yeah.
So the very reasonable idea that, more consumption makes you better off, but at a decreasing rate.
Okay. And I think this idea of not discounting the future is where things get really contentious, right? Because a lot of economists would argue that we should be applying a positive discount rate.
Absolutely. Economists often use a discount rate, which is usually represented by delta zero,
Hmm.
which then leads to a formula that looks like this. What this means is that well-being in the future is given less weight than well-being right now in the present. It's a way of reflecting the idea that we tend to value immediate benefits more than those that are, far off in the future.
But Ramsey was, vehemently opposed to this idea. He very famously called it ethically indefensible and said it stems from a weakness of the imagination, which is pretty strong language coming from an economist. And I think the economist Roy Harrod actually echoed this sentiment. He called positive discounting a polite expression for rapacity.
Yeah, their stance was rooted in this very deep belief in intergenerational fairness, that the well-being of people who will exist in the future should count just as much as our own. Even Robert Solow, who I think took a bit more of a pragmatic approach, he suggested that when we're thinking about these really serious ethical questions, we should act as if the discount rate were zero in a world where we can perfectly predict the future. It's about trying to really adopt um, that kind of philosophical perspective of timeless fairness.
But isn't there a counter argument here, though? Something to do with the fact that, if we invest today, that can lead to even greater benefits for future generations, which might actually justify a form of discounting in reverse.
You're exactly right. In Ramsey's model, the productivity of capital, FK, is positive. So that means that by saving and investing today, we can potentially create more than a one-for-one return in the future,
Hmm.
leading to higher levels of consumption down the line. So this inherent growth potential can create a kind of bias towards future generations if you think about it. And some argue that a positive discount rate might be needed to um, balance this out a little and ensure that well-being is more evenly distributed across time. And there's also this more practical consideration that in economic models that deal with finite resources, whether or not you include discounting can actually lead to very different conclusions about how those resources should be managed over the long term.
So it really boils down to this fundamental philosophical question of how we value the present versus the future and how that should be guiding our economic decisions as if we were acting as, these impartial philosophers.
Exactly. And Charlie Koopmans, I think, put it really well when he said that we need to be cautious about treating any single ethical principle as if it were, absolutely unquestionable. He argued that it's valuable to carefully examine what the implications of different ethical assumptions are in a variety of situations before you settle on a specific policy. So, deciding upfront whether or not to discount might be a bit too simplistic when we're dealing with these complex intergenerational issues.
Okay, so Ramsey was wrestling with this idea of an infinitely long future. When he was thinking about the optimal level of saving, why not just consider a shorter, more limited time frame?
That's a very insightful question. Ramsey reasoned that if you pick, a finite time period, let's say years, you're kind of forced to decide what happens at the end of that period, like what level of resources should be left for the future. But to justify that particular amount, you actually need to think about what happens beyond, which essentially pushes the problem further and further out. So this line of reasoning kind of naturally leads you to consider, an indefinite or infinite time horizon, especially when you're trying to adopt this long-term, almost philosophical viewpoint.
Which brings us to the different ways that Ramsey formulated the problem of how much a nation should optimally save. He started with what's often called Ramsey Mark, right?
Yeah, that's right. Ramsey Mark, I was basically an attempt to maximize VEVT, which is the total undiscounted well-being, from the present moment stretching out to infinity. And all of this, of course, has to respect the fundamental constraints of how, resources can be accumulated in the economy.
But there's this, I guess, significant mathematical challenge with this approach, right? Something about, infinite sums not always behaving in a predictable way.
Yeah, exactly. The big issue with Ramsey Mark the Hearth is that the total well-being integral, it might not converge to a finite number. And if the sum of well-being over an infinite period just keeps getting bigger and bigger, then the whole idea of finding a maximum doesn't really make sense mathematically. The cake-eating model that David Gale developed is a good way to visualize this. Imagine you have a cake that never goes bad. Anyway, you slice it, you're eventually going to eat the whole thing right. But if the happiness you get from eating even the tiniest crumb is positive, well, then the total happiness over time could become infinitely large. And in that case, you can't really say that one eating strategy is definitively the best.
So Ramsey came up with this, I guess, clever way to get around this in what's called Ramsey Mark II by introducing this concept of bliss.
Right. So Ramsey imagined that there's this maximum possible level of well-being, like an upper limit to how happy you can be no matter how much you consume. He called this bliss, which we can just call B. And in Ramsey Mark II, the goal is to maximize the VZTUC. The idea is to look at the total accumulated difference between this, ideal state of bliss and the actual level of well-being that people experience over time. If this accumulated shortfall converges to a finite value, well, then you can try to minimize it, which is essentially the same as maximizing the original integral in a way that makes mathematical sense.
And our sources actually point out that Ramsey's decision to use this approach, rather than just abandoning the whole idea of zero discounting, is a real testament to his, intellectual honesty. It shows a deep commitment to that philosophical principle.
I completely agree. He really stuck to his ethical conviction that all future well-being should be given equal weight. But he managed to find this really clever mathematical workaround to deal with the convergence problem. However, as the economist Sukhmoy Chakrabarty later pointed out, even with this renormalization, just focusing on the necessary conditions for an optimum, it might not guarantee that you've actually found a truly optimal outcome, especially if the renormalized integral itself doesn't converge properly.
So even with this renormalization, the convergence issue is still a bit of a stumbling block. And this is where the overtaking criterion comes in, which was developed by Koopmans and Carl Christian von Weizsäcker.
That's right. The overtaking criterion, or OC for short, offers a way to define what makes one long-term economic path better than another, um, even if those infinite sums of well-being don't necessarily converge to a finite number. So you can think of it like this. A consumption pattern, which we'll call is considered superior to another feasible pattern, if there's a point in time for which the total accumulated well-being under is always at least as large as the accumulated well-being under. So a path is optimal if it kind of overtakes all other feasible paths in this sense.
So it's about eventually doing better, even if those total sums might be, infinite or difficult to define precisely. And if the integrals do happen to converge, it lines up nicely with the original classical utilitarian idea.
That's a great way to put it. Um, the overtaking criterion really widens the scope of situations where we can meaningfully compare different long-term policies, especially when we're thinking about these, trying to act as these far-sighted philosophical economic planners.
Okay, so Ramsey did eventually explore the implications of what's called discounted utilitarianism. This is Ramsey Mark III. What was the reasoning behind that, especially given his initial, very strong ethical objections to the whole idea of discounting?
Well, while Ramsey himself was definitely philosophically opposed to discounting future well-being, he understood that it was a very common approach in economics.
Mhm.
And I think he wanted to explore what the consequences would be. So he formulated what we call Ramsey Mark III as maximizing the UDC, where you have a positive discount rate, delta zero. And this particular mathematical formulation often makes the analysis a lot simpler, especially when you move from thinking in continuous time to thinking in discrete periods.
And our sources actually mention a really interesting result by Peter Diamond, which is attributed to Menahem Yari. It's about the inherent challenges of not discounting. If you want your measure of intergenerational well-being to have some basic mathematical properties. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, sure. This is, I guess it's a bit of a technical point, but it's a very important one. So essentially what Diamond and Yari showed is that if you want your overall measure of well-being across generations to be continuous, meaning, small changes in the well-being of any particular generation should only lead to small changes in the overall measure. And also monotonic, meaning that if at least one generation is better off and no generation is worse off, then the overall well-being should be higher. If you want both of those things, then you almost inevitably have to incorporate some form of discounting for future generations. The structure of real numbers just isn't rich enough to accommodate an infinite number of, equally weighted well-being levels while still satisfying these seemingly reasonable properties. So it kind of throws a bit of a formal wrench into the pure zero discounting stance.
That's a pretty powerful argument in favor of discounting, at least from a theoretical perspective. And on a more practical level, using a positive discount rate often helps to ensure that you can actually find well-defined solutions in a lot of economic models.
Oh, for sure. It acts like a mathematical anchor, preventing things from just growing infinitely large. The source material also offers a pretty intriguing interpretation of the Ramsey Mark III outcome in terms of game theory. It suggests that you can think about a sequence of decision makers, each one acting in their own best interest, but all of them sharing the same underlying ethical principles. And the resulting optimal path of consumption and swerving, you can actually see it as a kind of non-cooperative equilibrium, where each decision maker's choice is the best they can do, given what future decision makers are expected to do.
This all leads us to the famous Ramsey rule. What exactly is this rule, and why is it such a key concept when we're thinking about, optimal economic management over the long term?
So the Ramsey rule is this, it's a fundamental principle that comes out of these optimization exercises. Essentially, it tells you what the ideal growth rate of consumption should be over time to maximize overall well-being. It balances our desire to consume more right now with the need to save and invest for future consumption. Taking into account both the productivity of capital and how much we value, extra consumption at different points in time, it's really a way of, putting some mathematical rigor behind this philosophical question of how do you allocate resources fairly across generations.
And how is this Ramsey rule expressed mathematically?
Okay, so the Ramsey rule is given by the equation Vero delta plus sigma. Let's break that down a bit. Vero represents the consumption rate of interest, or you could call it the social rate of discount. It essentially tells you how much future consumption is needed to compensate for giving up, a little bit of consumption today. And this takes into account both our pure time preference, which is delta, and this idea that the value of additional consumption diminishes as we get richer. And that's captured by sigma c, which is the elasticity of marginal well-being, which is the growth rate of consumption. This optimal rate has to be equal to FKT, which is the marginal product of capital. Basically, the rate at which saving and investing today translates into more output and therefore more potential consumption in the future.
So this is a condition that has to hold, at every point in time along this optimal path of consumption and investment. And the source actually notes that this rule stays the same, even if you use slightly different but still, ethically consistent ways of actually measuring well-being, which is, I guess, a reassuring sign of its robustness.
Absolutely. It means that the core guidance of the Ramsey rule isn't super sensitive to, minor variations in how exactly you define well-being. However, it is important to remember that the Ramsey rule by itself doesn't give you the whole picture. It tells you about the optimal growth rate of consumption, but it doesn't tell you what the initial level of consumption should be. So there could be many different paths that satisfy the Ramsey rule, but they start at different points.
And this incompleteness is illustrated in example two, which is called the linear economy. Can you walk us through that a bit?
Sure. In this simplified scenario, Ramsey considers a production function where output is directly proportional to the amount of capital, so EFK, where mu is a constant representing the return on investment. And he also uses a particular form for the well-being function, sigma, nature 1, where sigma is a constant greater than 1 that reflects how quickly the additional happiness from more consumption diminishes. Plugging these into the Ramsey rule leads to a relatively simple equation for how consumption should change over time, which looks like this: E delta sigma t. And what this shows is that in this linear economy, optimal consumption actually grows exponentially at a constant rate.
And this exponential growth rate depends on the return on capital, the discount rate, and how quickly that extra happiness from consumption diminishes, which is sigma. But as you said, the initial level of consumption is still not pinned down by this growth rate. So how do you actually figure that out?
The key insight here is that if consumption is growing exponentially at this rate, then for the economy to be sustainable in the long run, the capital stock also has to grow at that same rate. If capital grows slower, well, you won't be able to maintain those increasing levels of consumption. And if it grows faster, you might be sacrificing too much consumption in the present for future gains that you don't really need. So this requirement of balanced exponential growth implies that there's a constant optimal saving rate, which is mu delta, and an optimal consumption growth rate of G. And it's really interesting that if you take this, pure zero discounting stance, where delta is zero vero, then the optimal saving rate simplifies to mu sigma, which is a very elegant and I think intuitively appealing result. The more you care about having smoother consumption over time, the higher sigma is, the less you should be saving.
That's a really neat and thought-provoking result for this, case where we're acting as these purely impartial philosophers giving equal weight to all generations. But even with the Ramsey rule satisfied, we still need this additional condition about the long-run behavior of the economy to really pin down that optimal path. And this is where the transversality condition comes in.
Right. The transversality condition, as formalized by von Weizsäcker, really provides that missing piece of the puzzle. Essentially, it says that the present value of the economy's capital stock, as you look further and further into the future, shouldn't become infinitely large. Mathematically, this is expressed as E delta E co TT KT, right? ROA, a finite non-negative value as UCTTT is like the shadow price of consumption at time. So this condition rules out paths that might satisfy the Ramsey rule in the short run, but involve saving so much that the economy ends up with, a ridiculously large amount of capital in the distant future, which would mean that we could have consumed more in the present without harming long-run well-being. It ensures that our approach to saving is, balanced and sensible.
So the Ramsey rule gives you the right speed, and the transversality condition makes sure that you don't end up in some crazy place economically in the distant future. It's like having both the right direction and a sensible destination. And, our sources provide some numerical estimates based on the Ramsey rule, particularly in the context of the economics of climate change,
Yeah.
which is, a very real problem that forces us to think about these, long-term impacts.
Absolutely. It's a perfect example.
And this is really where, the rubber meets the road, where our ethical assumptions about the discount rate, delta, and our aversion to inequality, over time, which is sigma, where these things really show their practical consequences.
Oh, they really do. The source material actually examines the The specific values that prominent economists have used in their analyses of, climate change policy, people like William Klein, William Nordhaus, and Nicholas Stern. And these economists have quite different perspectives on what the appropriate values are for sigma and especially delta. And these differences really reflect fundamental disagreements about how much weight we should be giving to the well-being of current versus future generations. So, for instance, Klein used a sigma of 1.5 and a delta of 0, which reflects a very strong emphasis on, avoiding future climate damages and giving full weight to future well-being. Nordhaus used sigma 1 and delta zero point 0.03, putting a bit more weight on present consumption. And Stern famously argued for the very low delta 0.001, really emphasizing the, potentially catastrophic long-term impacts of climate change.
And these different choices about these parameters lead to dramatically different recommendations for how much we should actually be saving and investing today to try to mitigate climate change.
Yes, exactly. So Klein's parameters, with zero discounting and that higher sigma, they lead to a calculated optimal saving rate of something like 67% of global output.
Right.
And a consumption growth rate of 3.3% per year. Nordhaus's numbers suggest a more moderate optimal saving rate of about 40%. And a 2% consumption growth rate. But then you have Stern's near zero discount rate, which results in this, astonishingly high optimal saving rate of 98%, with consumption growing at 4.9% per year.
Wow, a 98% saving rate. That really highlights just how much impact even small differences in the discount rate, our philosophical stance on how much we value the future can have on, what we think are the justified economic actions we should be taking today. And the commentary in our sources, it also mentions Kupin's warning that we shouldn't just assume a zero or near zero discount rate without carefully considering, the potential burden this might place on the current generation, in the name of future well-being.
That's an important point. While the ethical appeal of giving equal weight to all generations is very strong, you have to think about the practical implications for the people alive today. And the Ramsey framework, even with its simplifications, really provides a powerful way to see how these fundamental ethical choices about discounting, combined with our scientific understanding of these long-term issues like climate change, how these things translate into concrete policy recommendations.
Yeah, it's remarkable how Ramsey, acting as this, philosopher economist almost a century ago, developed these ideas that are still incredibly relevant today, especially as we're dealing with these global challenges that unfold over, many generations.
For sure. He tackled these, seemingly impossible questions about how to even think about long-term societal well-being. And he did it with, these incredibly simplified but profoundly insightful models. His real gift to theoretical economics, I think, lies in his ability to just illuminate the fundamental principles that are at play when we, try to adopt that long-sighted perspective, the philosophical perspective on economic decision-making.
So to kind of bring it all together, Ramsey's work, even though it took some time to really gain traction, has become this foundational framework for how we think about well-being across generations. And I think the central challenge that we've been exploring here is this this really delicate balancing act between our needs and desires today and our responsibility to those who will come after us, especially in areas like saving investment and dealing with these, long-term environmental threats like climate change.
And at the heart of this balancing act are these very fundamental ethical considerations. Most importantly, our choice of discount rate. How much weight we give to future well-being compared to our own. And it seems like such a simple decision, but has these huge implications for the conclusions that we reach in any kind of economic analysis that spans generations. It really does require us to engage in philosophical reasoning.
It really underscores this idea that, acting as philosophers in this context isn't just some abstract, intellectual exercise. It's about making very real value judgments about, our obligations to the future, judgments that have, real consequences for the policies we adopt today.
So absolutely. We are essentially making ethical pronouncements about intergenerational justice through these economic frameworks and the parameters that we choose. And Ramsey's work really gives us this structured way to approach this inherently philosophical endeavor.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener. Given all of the, complexities and the trade-offs that we've been talking about, working through Ramsey's framework, What discount rate for future well-being do you personally find ethically justifiable? And how should that stance influence how you think about acting today on issues that will have, profound and lasting impacts down the line?
It's a question that I think really invites all of us
Mm.
to